I bought my dad a house but refused to let my deadbeat brother move in. He turned the whole family against me. I'm Sam, 32F, and I've been saving up for years to buy my dad, Mark, 68M, a new house. The story of how we got here is a long and complicated one, so bear with me. Our family used to be pretty normal: mom, dad, me, and my younger brother Jake, 28M. We lived in a modest house in the suburbs, and while we weren't rich, we were comfortable. Dad worked as a high school history teacher, and mom was a part-time librarian. They both loved their jobs and always emphasized the importance of education to us kids. Everything changed when I was 15 and Jake was 11. Mom was diagnosed with an aggressive form of cancer. The next year was a blur of hospital visits, treatments, and mounting medical bills. Despite everyone's best efforts, Mom passed away just before my 16th birthday. It was devastating for all of us, but especially for Dad. In the aftermath of Mom's death, our family dynamics shifted dramatically. Dad was struggling to balance his grief, his job, and raising 2 kids on his own. He started working longer hours to make ends meet, which meant he was home less. I tried to step up, taking on more responsibilities around the house and looking after Jake. Jake, however, didn't handle Mom's death well at all. He became withdrawn and started acting out in school. Dad was too overwhelmed to address Jake's behavior properly, and I was just a teenager myself, ill-equipped to handle my brother's emotional needs. As the years went by, the situation at home deteriorated. Dad was working himself to the bone, often picking up summer school and evening classes to supplement his income. I focused on my studies, determined to make something of myself and make Mom proud. Jake, on the other hand, seemed to give up entirely. He started skipping school, hanging out with a rough crowd, and getting into trouble. By the time I graduated high school, Jake had already dropped out. I left for college with a mixture of relief and guilt: relief to escape the tense atmosphere at home, and guilt for leaving Dad to deal with Jake alone. Throughout college, I worked part-time jobs to support myself and send a little money home when I could. During my visits home, I noticed how much older and more tired Dad looked each time. The house was falling into disrepair, with Dad lacking the time, energy, or money to keep up with maintenance. Jake was still living at home, now 18 and working sporadically at minimum wage jobs that never seemed to last. After college, I landed a good job in marketing. As soon as I was financially stable, I started putting money aside each month with the goal of helping Dad. At first, I thought about just giving him money, but I knew he was too proud to accept regular handouts. That's when I came up with the idea of buying him a new house, a gift he couldn't refuse that would dramatically improve his quality of life. It took years of saving, living frugally, and picking up freelance work on the side, but I finally managed to save enough for a down payment on a small but comfortable 2-bedroom house in a nice neighborhood near Dad's school. It has a decent-sized yard where he can garden, a hobby he loved but gave up years ago due to lack of time, and is close to amenities he needs. I was thrilled to finally be able to do this for him. Last month, I invited Dad and Jake over for dinner to share the news. I cooked Mom's old lasagna recipe, a family favorite we rarely had anymore, and even managed to get Jake to show up on time, which was a minor miracle in itself. After dinner, I told them about the house. Dad was overjoyed and grateful, tears in his eyes as he hugged me. But Jake's reaction quickly soured the moment. He immediately asked when we could all move in. The look on his face when I explained that the house was just for Dad was a mixture of shock and anger I'll never forget. Jake exploded, calling me selfish and accusing me of trying to separate him from Dad. He ranted about how I'd abandoned the family years ago to go to college, while he'd stayed behind to take care of Dad. This was news to me, as from what I'd seen and heard from Dad, Jake had never contributed much to the household. He said I was leaving him homeless, and that I owed him a place to live too since we're family. Dad tried to calm Jake down, but Jake was having none of it. He stormed out, slamming the door so hard a picture fell off the wall. In the ringing silence that followed, Dad just looked tired and sad. Over the next few days, Jake bombarded me with angry texts and voicemails. He's even gotten some of our extended family involved. Aunts and uncles who don't know the full story are calling me, saying I'm heartless for not helping my brother and that I'm tearing the family apart. I feel awful about the situation, but I don't think I'm wrong. I worked hard for years to give Dad a better life in his retirement, not to provide free housing for my almost 30-year-old brother who's never tried to support himself. Dad deserves to enjoy his new home without having to take care of Jake. Plus, I'm worried Jake will trash the place or invite sketchy friends over if he moves in. The house is big enough for Dad to have Jake visit or even stay for short periods, but I'm firm on it not becoming Jake's permanent residence. Dad seems torn. He's grateful for the house but hates seeing Jake upset. He suggested maybe we could let Jake stay just until he gets on his feet, but I've heard that line too many times over the years. I don't want this gift to turn into another source of stress for Dad. Am I the asshole for standing firm on this? Should I have bought a bigger house to accommodate Jake too? I really thought I was doing a good thing, but now I feel like I've caused more problems than I've solved. The thought of Dad finally being able to relax and enjoy his retirement keeps me going, but the family drama is taking its toll. I'm starting to question whether I should have done this at all. Update 1: It's been about 3 weeks since my last post, and a lot has happened. First, I want to thank everyone for their supportive comments and advice. It really helped me stand my ground and feel more confident in my decision. After the initial blow-up, Jake continued to harass me with calls and texts. His messages ranged from angry tirades about how I've always been the favorite child to guilt-tripping pleas about how he has nowhere else to go. He even showed up at my workplace once, causing a scene in the lobby. He was yelling about family loyalty and how I owed him. I had to threaten to call security before he left. My coworkers were understanding, but I was mortified and stressed about potential repercussions at work. Dad was really upset about the whole situation and kept trying to mediate between us. He'd call me almost daily, alternating between expressing gratitude for the house and suggesting compromises to appease Jake. It was clear the stress was taking a toll on him. He sounded exhausted on the phone, and when I visited him, I noticed he wasn't sleeping well. About a week after my original post, I decided we needed to have a real heart-to-heart. I went over to Dad's current house on a Saturday afternoon. Jake was out, which was a relief. The house was in even worse shape than I remembered: water stains on the ceiling, peeling wallpaper, and a musty smell throughout. We sat at the old kitchen table, the same one we'd had family dinners around when Mom was alive, and I poured out everything I'd been feeling. I explained that while I loved Jake, I couldn't enable his behavior anymore. I told Dad about all the nasty messages Jake had been sending me and how he'd shown up at my work. Dad was shocked. He had no idea how bad things had gotten. During our talk, Dad opened up about how difficult it's been living with Jake. He admitted that Jake often stays out all night, brings home strangers, and leaves the house a mess. There had been a few instances where items went missing after Jake's friends visited, though Jake always denied any knowledge of it. Dad said he's been too afraid to confront Jake about his behavior because he doesn't want Jake to leave and end up on the streets. It broke my heart to hear how much stress this has been causing Dad. We talked for hours, reminiscing about Mom and how different things might have been if she was still here. Dad confessed that he felt he'd failed both of us in some way, me by not being able to support me more, and Jake by not being able to guide him onto a better path. I reassured Dad that he'd done his best in an impossible situation. After our conversation, Dad agreed that it would be best for Jake not to move into the new house. He said he was ready to have some peace and quiet in his life, to finally focus on himself after years of struggling. We decided to set a move-in date for Dad, 2 weeks from our talk. When we told Jake about the decision, he completely lost it. It was worse than his initial reaction. He accused me of turning Dad against him and said some really hurtful things to both of us. He dredged up old grievances, blaming me for abandoning the family when I went to college and Dad for always favoring me. He even threatened to contest Mom's will from years ago, claiming she would have wanted him to have a share of any property bought for Dad. This is ridiculous because Mom didn't leave any property, and the house was bought entirely with my own money. The day after this confrontation, Jake disappeared. He took some of his stuff from Dad's house and left without saying where he was going. Dad was worried sick, but I reminded him that Jake is an adult and can make his own choices. Still, I could see the toll it was taking on Dad. He kept checking his phone, hoping for a message from Jake. Despite the drama, we went ahead with Dad's move as planned. The weekend of the move was bittersweet. As we packed up the old house, we found so many memories: old photos, Mom's cookbooks, our childhood toys. Dad got choked up a few times, and honestly, so did I. It was the end of an era, closing the chapter on the house where we'd grown up and where we'd last been a complete family. But as we unpacked in the new house, I could see Dad's spirits lifting. He spent a long time in the backyard, already planning where he'd plant his vegetable garden. He seemed lighter somehow, as if the fresh start was allowing him to let go of some of the stress and guilt he'd been carrying. We still haven't heard directly from Jake, but one of his friends told us he's been crashing on their couch. Apparently, he's been badmouthing me to anyone who'll listen, painting himself as the victim of a cruel sister and a father who chose favorites. It hurts, but I'm trying not to let it get to me. I'm feeling a mix of relief and guilt. I'm glad Dad is settled and comfortable, but I can't help worrying about Jake. I know it's not my responsibility to house him, but it's hard to shake the feeling that I've somehow failed as a sister. Dad assures me I've done the right thing, but it's still weighing on me. For now, I'm trying to focus on the positives. Dad is safe and comfortable in his new home. He's talking about joining a local history society and maybe even dating again. It's amazing to see him looking forward to things for the first time in years. As for Jake, I hope this will be the wake-up call he needs to get his life together. But I also know I can't control his choices. All I can do is be there for Dad and hope that someday, Jake will understand why I did what I did. I'll post another update if anything significant happens. Thanks again for all your support. It really means a lot to have a place to share this and get unbiased opinions. Update 2. It's been about 2 months since my last update, and there have been some developments I wanted to share. About 3 weeks after Dad moved into the new house, Jake suddenly reappeared. He showed up at Dad's new place unannounced, looking pretty rough. His clothes were dirty, he'd lost weight, and he had dark circles under his eyes. Apparently, he'd been couch surfing with various friends but had worn out his welcome everywhere. When Dad called to tell me Jake was there, I could hear the conflict in his voice. He was relieved to see Jake was okay but worried about falling back into old patterns. I drove over immediately, unsure of what I'd find. When I arrived, Jake was sitting at the kitchen table, wolfing down a sandwich Dad had made him. The sight brought back memories of Jake as a teenager, always hungry and raiding the fridge after school. For a moment, it was like nothing had changed. But then Jake looked up, and the guarded, almost hostile look in his eyes brought me back to reality. Jake apologized to Dad for his behavior and asked if he could stay just for a few days until he got back on his feet. He avoided looking at me directly. Dad, being Dad, had already agreed without consulting me first. When I pulled Dad aside to remind him that this was supposed to be his fresh start, not a repeat of the old situation, Jake overheard and snapped at me for trying to control everything. We spent the next hour in a tense discussion. Jake accused me of never giving him a chance, while I pointed out his history of broken promises and taking advantage of Dad's generosity. Dad sat there looking miserable, and I felt guilty for causing him stress in what was supposed to be his peaceful new home. Finally, we came to a compromise. Jake could stay for 2 weeks maximum, but only if he agreed to some strict rules. 1. He had to actively look for a job and show proof of applications. 2. He had to contribute to groceries and keep the common areas clean. 3. No guests allowed without Dad's permission. 4. He had to attend a free financial literacy workshop at the local community center. To my surprise, Jake agreed to everything without much argument. I think the reality of having nowhere else to go finally sunk in. Or maybe he was just telling us what we wanted to hear, I wasn't sure. Over the next 2 weeks, Jake actually seemed to be making an effort. He got a job at a local warehouse and started the financial literacy course. He was keeping the house tidy and even cooking dinner for Dad sometimes. One evening, I stopped by to find them watching an old movie together, laughing at the cheesy special effects. It reminded me of better times, back when we were kids and everything was simpler. Dad was thrilled with the change and started hinting that maybe Jake could stay longer. I was skeptical. I've seen Jake make short-term improvements before, only to slide back into old habits. But seeing how happy it made Dad, I reluctantly agreed to extend Jake's stay by another month, as long as he kept up with the rules and started saving for his own place. Things were going smoothly for a while. Jake was bringing home paychecks, and Dad reported that he was even talking about maybe going back to school to finish his GED. I started to wonder if maybe I'd been too hard on Jake, if maybe this was the turning point he needed. But then, last week, everything fell apart. Dad called me in a panic. Jake hadn't come home for 2 days and wasn't answering his phone. His work called to ask why he hadn't shown up for his shifts. We were both worried sick, imagining all sorts of terrible scenarios. Finally, on the 3rd day, Jake showed up. He stumbled in early in the morning, clearly hungover and possibly still drunk. When Dad pressed him about where he'd been, Jake admitted he'd lost his job. According to him, his boss had it out for him and fired him unfairly, but given Jake's state, I had my doubts about his version of events. Apparently, after losing his job, Jake had gone on a bender with some old friends. He'd spent all the money he'd saved over the past weeks on alcohol and who knows what else. He was belligerent and unapologetic, saying he deserved to blow off some steam after working so hard. This incident made it clear that Jake still has a long way to go. The look of disappointment on Dad's face was heartbreaking. For a moment, I was furious with Jake for letting Dad down yet again. But mostly, I just felt sad for both of them. After Jake sobered up, we had a family meeting. Even Jake seemed to realize he'd crossed a line. There were tears and recriminations, but in the end, we all agreed it was time for Jake to leave. It wasn't an easy decision, especially for Dad, but we knew it was necessary. We helped Jake find a room to rent in a shared house and gave him enough money for the first month's rent and a security deposit. As we helped him move his meager belongings into his new room, I felt a mix of emotions: relief that he was out of Dad's house, worry about whether he'd be okay on his own, and a lingering sadness for the relationship we'd never had. Now, a week later, Dad is back to enjoying his retirement in peace. He's joined a local gardening club and seems to be making friends in the neighborhood. He calls Jake every couple of days to check in, and while those calls are often short and a bit awkward, at least they're talking. As for Jake, he's been in his new place for a week now. He's not thrilled about it, but he's managing. I'm trying to maintain boundaries while still being supportive. I check in with him every few days but make it clear that he needs to stand on his own 2 feet now. I'm feeling more confident about my decisions, but it's still a tough situation. I hope Jake can turn things around, but I know it has to come from him. The road ahead isn't going to be easy for any of us, but at least now we're all moving forward. Dad seems to be doing well, although I can tell he misses having Jake around. He's been throwing himself into his gardening and has started volunteering at a local history museum. It's good to see him pursuing his own interests after so many years of just trying to keep his head above water. As for me, I'm trying to focus on my own life a bit more. This whole situation has been all-consuming for months, and I realized I've been neglecting my own needs. I've started seeing a therapist to work through some of the guilt and stress I've been carrying. It's helping, slowly but surely. I'll post another update if there are any major changes. Thanks for listening, Reddit. Your support has meant more than you know. Update 3. Hello again, Reddit. It's been about 4 months since my last update, and I wanted to share some final thoughts on this whole situation. Dad has really settled into his new home and life. It's amazing to see the transformation. He's become quite the social butterfly in his new neighborhood, hosting weekly card games and tending to his thriving garden. Last week, he showed me his tomato plants with the pride of a new parent. It's been years since I've seen him this excited about anything. His health has even improved. His doctor says his blood pressure is down, which I think is due to the reduced stress. He started taking daily walks around the neighborhood and has lost a bit of weight. The other day, he mentioned he might join a seniors yoga class at the community center. Who knew retirement would turn Dad into such a health nut? As for Jake, well, it's been a bumpy road. He managed to keep his room in the shared house for about 2 months before getting kicked out for not paying rent. He couch surfed again for a while, which was really hard on Dad. We were both worried he'd end up on the streets. But then something unexpected happened. Jake's old high school friend, Alex, reached out to him. I vaguely remember Alex from when we were kids. He was always a good kid, kind of quiet but really into plants and nature. Turns out Alex owns a small landscaping business in a town about an hour away. He offered Jake a job and a place to stay. It was a fresh start away from his old habits and crowd. Surprisingly, Jake took the offer. He's been working for Alex for about 6 weeks now. From what Dad tells me, they talk on the phone every few days. Jake is doing okay. He's learning the landscaping trade, has his own small apartment above Alex's garage, and is slowly paying back some of the money he owes Dad. I'm cautiously optimistic. Jake and I aren't exactly close. There's still a lot of hurt feelings on both sides, but we're civil when we talk. He even sent me a text last week thanking me for the kick in the butt he needed. It wasn't much, but it felt like progress. Last weekend, Jake came to visit Dad. I dropped by briefly, mainly to check on Dad, and found them working in the garden together. It was a bit awkward at first, but as I watched them argue good-naturedly about the best way to stake tomato plants, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, with time and distance, we can start to heal as a family. Dad is happier than I've seen him in years. The shadow of stress that seemed to follow him everywhere has lifted. He's talking about taking a short trip next month, nothing fancy, just a weekend at a nearby lake, but for Dad, who hasn't taken a vacation in over a decade, it's a big deal. He's also mentioned maybe getting a dog for company. I think it would be good for him. As for me, I feel like a weight has been lifted. I was carrying so much worry and responsibility for both Dad and Jake. Now, I can just enjoy spending time with Dad without constantly stressing about the situation. I've started dating again and am even considering taking a promotion at work that would require more travel. For the first time in years, I feel like I can focus on my own life without feeling guilty. That's not to say everything is perfect. There are still tough days. Dad misses having Jake around sometimes, and I know he worries about him. I still have moments of doubt, wondering if I could have handled things differently. But overall, I believe we're all in a better place now. I've learned a lot through this experience, about setting boundaries, the complexities of family dynamics, and the importance of allowing people to face the consequences of their actions. It wasn't easy, and there were times I doubted myself, but I truly believe I made the right choice for everyone involved. Thank you, Reddit, for all your support and advice throughout this journey. It really helped me stay strong when things got tough. I don't think I'll need to post any more updates, but I'm grateful for this community and the chance to share my story. To anyone out there dealing with similar family issues, hang in there. It's not easy, but sometimes the hardest decisions are the ones that lead to the most growth. Here's hoping for brighter days ahead for all of us.